Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a special book review of the book Rhymer by Gregory Frost, the first book in a planned trilogy. I'll be honest, this book wasn't on my radar ordinarily. However, Baen, the publisher, contacted me and wanted me to do an interview with the author. And so the interview is either already out or will be out very soon. So I don't know when this video is going up as I record this, but the interview will be up soon. And so I felt like if I was going to do an interview with the author, I needed to know the material, I needed to do the research. So I read the book and I enjoyed it, and I'll explain here. There's some hits, there's some misses, but let's talk about what I thought of it. The first thing I'll say is that the book basically has three phases. It has its historical fiction phase, which is towards the beginning. Then you have a little bit more of like a dark fantasy phase, which is a little bit at the beginning, but is primarily in the middle section of the book. And then towards the end of the book, it actually feels more high fantasy. I would say if you had to give the whole book if you had to cut it into one genre, I guess you could call it fantasy. But dark fairy tale is a good subgenre to put in this, and historical fiction as well, because there's a lot of research, I think, done into the historical nature of the book. The book is about a character named Thomas the Rhymer, who does exist in literature and at least in some history, where it was one of the children's ballads, child ballads, number 37 was about Thomas the Rhymer, and it told about this man who had the ability to tell prophecies, and these prophecies started to come true. Now, in this book, our main character does have prophecies, and these prophecies start coming true. However, like the ballad deals with him dealing with dark elves, and this book has to deal with dark elves. Although this book goes much more into detail of magic and all that type of thing, whereas the ballad really doesn't go that far into it. When I say dark elves, do not think Tolkienian elves. I would think a better explanation is body snatching aliens. Those are basically what you're dealing with here. The word used is elves, but it's really body snatching aliens that you need to get your mind around. Basically, aliens that will inhabit the bodies of humans. And so it's set in the late 1100s, early 1200s, just like the actual Thomas the Rhymer was, except this book has otherworldly aspects to it. It has elves, it has fantasy elements, and magic systems, all that stuff. So it's not a true historical fiction, which is why Baen published it, because it is a fantasy. So that's a lot of weird context, but I actually find it quite interesting, because that's a lot of the trying to figure out how do you market a book like this. As I said, the first part of the book feels a lot like a historical fiction. There's a little bit in the first chapter. There's a little bit of a supernatural element, but most of the rest of part one is a historical fiction. The main character, Thomas, his brother is kidnapped by the elves, and now Thomas is basically trying to just survive now, and Thomas himself is a very sympathetic character. Not only do you have to deal with his brother being kidnapped, but everyone ridicules Thomas. They view him as very dumb. He has a hyperfixation on things, which makes me wonder if the author meant for him to have autism or Asperger's or something, because he has to hyper-focus and hyperfixate on certain numbers and certain equations and things, and the prophecies kind of fall into that as well. And he ends up working as a mason, and then eventually he really wants to know what happened to his family, because his brother was kidnapped and he hasn't seen his parents in years. And so he tries to go see them, and as you would expect, chaos has ensued. And you throughout the book, you just want him to be happy and you want him to find peace. And no matter what happens, you feel like that just doesn't happen. Every time he takes one step forward, the toll and the emotions taken on him take two steps back. And you just feel really bad for him, which is, I think, an effective way to make you care for your main character. But if I'm being honest, the first 50 pages of the book move really slowly. I would say even the first 100 pages total still move pretty slowly. It's not until you get around part 2 where you get to him starting to meet new characters, where it's really picking up. The first part is just so slow, but it makes it worth it in the end. A lot of stuff from part one is paid off at the end of the book, but you just have to go through that really slow part one to get there. And maybe other people will think that part one is very energetic, but I thought the part one was very slow. But part two speeds it up, and part three turns into a dark fantasy super fast. But part three is hard to read. Woo! Part three, you are dealing with some dark stuff, and I'll be honest, I didn't love when it got super dark, but it was engaging. This book does something that a few other books I've read have done, like Wizard's First Rule, from Terry Goodkind, and then also Warrior of the Altai from Robert Jordan. Both of those books deal with our main character getting into captivity with someone evil, and some things happen to the character that I do not like reading about in my books, even if you're doing it for a reason. I still don't like reading about that, and that happens here. It's not too long. It's nowhere near as long as the sections in Wizard's First Rule, but it's still present, and it was still icky to read and frustrating to read. I think of the three books I mentioned, Warrior of the Altai does it the quickest, so I'll give it that one book credit. And this book, it's still not that long, but it's still there. But once you get into part four, which is the final part of this book, is by far, hands down, the best part of the book. When you get into the final climactic action sequence. And as I was reading the book, I kept thinking, how are you going to make a trilogy out of this story? Because it seemed like everything was being set up for this to be a standalone book. Up until parts 1, 2, and 3, I was like, man, they're cramming so much character development, so much plot development, so much into this promise and payoff type thing. I thought, how can you have future books? And then stuff in part 4 happens that made me realize, oh, that's where they're going with the story. And I thought that Gregory Frost did a fantastic job of paying things off in the final act. I thought he did a fantastic job of subverting expectations while also meeting expectations. Certain things had to happen with a twist that I really appreciated. So I'm telling you, part 1 is the hardest one. Part 2 gets more interesting. Part 3 is very interesting, but frustrating to read at points. I think part 3, because of the setting has an otherworldliness to it. I can't get into why until you read it, but the setting has an otherworldliness to it, and that's, I think, what makes it just so compelling of a story. And then part 4 is just, the great climax. It's just so well done. There is an interesting writing choice that I really appreciated here, specifically with the tenses used. So whenever you're reading stuff in the main part of, which I believe the main story is taking place in France, although it happens throughout Europe from what I understand. But most of the story, when you're in that France-Europe storyline in the main place, you read it in past tense, like just about 99% of all other books are. However, when the book flips and starts happening in the otherworldly nature, which is what I alluded to earlier, the otherworldly type thing, that takes place in present tense. Instead of Thomas stepped on a twig, it's Thomas steps on a twig. Thomas got quiet. Thomas gets quiet. And everything feels like there's an immediacy to it. And it throws you off in a good way. It makes you realize something is wrong, something is happening here. And that switch was really well executed. Other authors have done it before. I think that the other best example, and this, you may not have read this book because I'm talking about fantasy and I'm going to allude to something else, but another book that did this well was a Star Wars book called Phasma, where the stuff happening in the present day of the story was in present tense, and the stuff happening in the past was in past tense. That was, I think, a tremendously useful use of this idea. However, it still works really well here because it lets you know something's up, and I really appreciated that. So when you get there, you might feel like this is odd. Why did the editor forget to proof this? No, the editor meant to. It was on purpose. So Overall, I had an interesting time with the book. It's not a favorite of the year. It's not even in the upper echelons of the year. But it's an entertaining book. It's an entertaining first story. I think that this book will be hard to market to people because is that blend of historical fiction, dark fantasy, and dark fairy tale, and then plus the fact that it doesn't have an opening sequence. Like the first chapter is actually quite well written, but the first 100 pages don't propel you forward with the frantic energy that a lot of fantasy books do today, and so it's a slow burn. And I think people are used to only the best of the best authors, or at least the most popular authors, having a slow burn, and new authors having to have breakneck paces. And so this will be probably difficult to market to people, but it's still enjoyable. And at the end of the day, I had fun. I researched the child ballad, and I got to read it. And I just had a blast with everything with this book overall, especially towards the end. I'm telling you, part 4 was really entertaining, really entertaining. So I give the book a 7 out of 10. Enjoyable, not the best, but very enjoyable. So if you've read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you're interested in the book, let me know all that in the comment section down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.